I'll turn on our transcription comments because we are going to be using a lot of Pennsylvania German words tonight. And the miracles of closed captioning are phonetic. We should have some interesting captions tonight. Finally, for those of you who have questions, if you will post them in the chat section of the Zoom platform, we will then pose them to Alan either throughout the program as they're relevant or wait until the end of the program. So without further ado, I present to you Mr. Alan Viehmeyer. So Alan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dave. I'm really pleased to be here this evening, and I hope you are able to enjoy this PowerPoint presentation on Caspar Schwenckfeld and the Schwenkfelders, and get to know a little bit about the Schwenkfelders here in the upper part of Montgomery County. As we get started here, I'd like to spend a few minutes I have something about this meeting being recorded on top of my my PowerPoint has this sign over it. I don't know if that's visible to the viewers or not, but it's right in the middle of the photo.
No, we don't see anything other than a little red pointer.
Oh, do you see a map?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Introduction and a map.
All right. Well, I'm going to have to work around the sign about this meeting being recorded. Let's see. Okay. So the Schwenkfeld and the Schwenkfelders come originally from an area in Europe on the far eastern edge of Germany called Silesia. And this right here is the Silesian area. And the Schwenkfelders were located roughly in this area right here. And when Schwenkfeld was exiled from that territory, he traveled all the way over here to Strasbourg on the far western side of Germany and stayed originally in the city of Strasbourg. And of course, everyone is acquainted with the southeastern part of Pennsylvania, where the Schwenkfelders came in 1734.
Alan, you should be able to click on that recorded sign, click on got it on the box, and that should make it disappear.
Yes, I have, it has disappeared.
Okay, great, great. Carry on.
Okay, now I'm trying to change the slide.
Yeah, click on next. Oh.
Okay.
There we are.
All right. First, we're going to say a few words about Caspar Schwenckfeld von Ossig. You can see his birth and death date there, 1489 to 1561. And we actually happen to have an authentic portrait, contemporary portrait of Caspar Schwenckfeld. This was painted in 1556, roughly 8 years before his death. And at that time, 1556, he was 66 years old. You see in the upper right-hand corner here, his coat of arms. There's a little person here on the top, and in the shield here, there are three spade-like images. And we're going to see that in several different slides. Here we see the coat of arms. This one is in our building. It's carved out of wood in relief. This comes from an old book. But I can tell you that the Schwenkfelders were part of the lower nobility. They gained their nobility through the Battle of Wolstadt against the Mongols in 1241 and received for their service a land grant. There's in this town of Ossig, that's why he's called Schwenckfeld von Ossig. In that particular small town, there's still a church that the family attended, and there are several epitaphs in the church building for members of the Schwenkfeld family from that generation of 14 to 1500s. Of course, he was born into a Catholic world, but he himself wrote in a couple of different spots that he was really not all that interested in religion as a young man, let's say as prior to the age of 20. In 1517, Luther published the thesis, the so-called 95 Theses, which became very popular among people who eventually became Lutherans or Protestants. And Schwenkfeld followed Luther for about 8 years and probably would have called himself a Lutheran up until about 1523 or 25. So Schwenkfeld sort of roamed the countryside. He preached and published treatises about the Reformation and the changes that he thought needed to be made. He talked to clergy as well as lay people. And one example is when he visited the sisters of the cloister Naumburg in 1523, where he urged them to strive diligently to acquire the divine word, which is the only food for your souls. The Schwenkfelders who came here to southeastern Pennsylvania came from a specific area in Silesia, where the village of Harpersdorf was the main center. And in Harpersdorf, many of these Schwenkfelders lived, but they also lived in villages out and around the town. The Viehweg literally means cattle path. And next to this cattle path was sort of a potter's grounds where people could be buried who were not qualified to be buried in sacred grounds. And that's where the Schwenkfelders were buried who would not join the Lutheran Church or the Catholic Church. This particular area in Silesia, where Harpersdorf is located, was actually the scene of severe fighting in World War II. It's really on a front between the Russian and the German forces. And this monument that had been erected in 1863 was fairly severely damaged. But in the early 2000s, it was repaired to this state. The original monument did not have this boulder in front of it. The monument itself is in German, as we would expect, because all the people at that particular time in the Harpersdorf area were German speaking. But since then, it's now a Polish speaking area. And so one side translates this German into Polish and the other side translates it into English. You really can't see it on this photo, but here you can see a little better that this ornamentation here is again the coat of arms of Schwenkfeld. Schwenkfeld had an education that was probably commensurate with his social class, the lower nobility. He tells us that he attended the university in Cologne. He ended his university career at Freiburg on the Oder, which is on the border between Germany and Silesia. He did not take a degree. We're fairly certain that he studied canon law and that he did not study theology. As far as his theology is concerned, he's probably mainly self-educated and did a lot of Bible study in the early 1520s. As a profession, he was actually a courtier and advisor to certain dukes in the Liegnitz area. And prior to joining the court of Duke Friedrich II in Liegnitz, he had attended at 2 other courts. I'd like to sum up some of the highlights here of his activities 1517 to 1529. As I said before, he was promoting Luther's reforms, but he was also assessing the result of those reforms, and he was really not satisfied that anything was changing. He felt that if people upheld the reforms and tried to do what was suggested, that they would turn out to be better Christians, their behavior would be much more Christian. But he didn't believe that that was happening. Eventually, he convinced the Duke Friedrich to introduce the Lutheran Reformation to his Catholic territory. Duke Friedrich was the top administrator in that particular area of Silesia, so he had quite a few people under his command. Schwenkfeld also became active in different debates, and some of them were in person, some of them were printed in a book form and circulated. In 1526, Schwenkfeld urged a Stillstand, that is a stopping of taking communion publicly in church. The Stillstand is the word always used in the scholarship to refer to this ceasing of taking public communion, but there was no prohibition to private communion. In 1520, eventually his treatise on the Eucharist came to the attention of the overlord of Silesia, and this emperor, or actually king, had made a law that, or had decreed that anyone who did not believe in the real presence and who was not teaching the real presence in the Eucharist would be executed. And so there is a great deal of trepidation about urging people to follow this Stillstand that Schwenkfeld thought might be necessary. So Schwenkfeld is eventually exiled. He goes from Harpersdorf all the way across Germany to the border, to today's border with France, and stayed in Strasbourg, which was a free city at that time. That is, it was under city governance. It had no other governor other than the emperor. Schwenkfeld was in exile from 1529 to 1561, the rest of his life, about 40 years. He was in Strasbourg for about 6 years when the city government in Strasbourg changed considerably. And so he had to leave Strasbourg or he would be incarcerated. He had several, or many, I should say, many converts in Southwest Germany who followed him in his religious beliefs. And he attended to most of these people through correspondence. We have lots and lots of correspondence in our library. And he did still publish some books, although they often ended up being burned. Schwenckfeld never started out to write any theology. And so when he did start to do this, he learned quite a bit. He had friends that would help him in the very beginning. But there is no intention by Schwenckfeld to write an entire systematic theology. He was focused mainly on Christology and the Eucharist. So he continued developing his philosophy there in Southwest Germany. He would go from place to place, stay in hiding. He had many friends that hid him. And he refined his theology of the glorified Christ, which also included components of the celestial flesh and the idea of the new man. That I'm going to be talking about a little later. And as I said, he published many theses on the theology. He died peacefully at the home of a major follower family in Ulm, in the presence of many of his followers. And his followers, the Schwenkfelders in Southwest Germany, died out around 1600. We do not find any Schwenkfelders left in Southwest Germany. Schwenckfeld believed deeply that physical things make mankind aware of God's potential works, that it is the Holy Spirit that works within each person. There is an outer physical person and an inner spiritual essence. An old man becomes a new man. So just as the physical water cleans our bodies, so too does the spiritual water cleanse our souls. And the physical bread and wine feed our physical bodies, just as the spiritual bread and wine feed our hungry souls. There is a physical church and a spiritual church. There is the word that is heard and seen, but there's also a spiritual word, or the logos. So this idea of the new man, I think in modern parlance, we might say he's talking here about a born-again Christian. Next, I'd like to spend a little time with the Schwenkfelders and Silesia. Between 1529 and 1719, Schwenkfeld did not have any contact with his followers in Silesia. And Duke Friedrich was urged to purge all the Lutheran clergy with Schwenkfeld sympathies from his territories. So that in Silesia, the Schwenkfelders really ended up with sort of a spotty knowledge of Schwenkfeld's publications that he did while he was in exile. After the 30 Years' War, the Schwenkfelders lived really in a Protestant enclave surrounded totally by Catholic territory. And the Lutheran church in Harpersdorf, where the Schwenkfelders were, became known as a refuge church. That is, certain churches were given permission to hold services for Protestants within this Catholic territory. And in Harpersdorf, the church was one of these refuge churches. In 1719, Jesuits came to Harpersdorf specifically to convert the Schwenkfelders to Catholicism. That, of course, the Schwenkfelders did not want to see. They sent a delegation to the emperor in Vienna to plead for tolerance. But after 4 or 5 years of attempting to do that, they came back to Harpersdorf empty-handed. And so they knew they had to leave, and they had been looking for a refuge. And so right after the delegation returned from Vienna, the Schwenkfelders started to move to Zinzendorf's estate in Saxony, where they were settled as refugees. So first, they went to Herrenhut, where the Moravians lived, beginning in 1722. And Zinzendorf soon resettled the Schwenkfelders in Bertelsdorf, that was about a mile away from Zinzendorf's residence. And there they were permitted to buy or build their homes in the Lutheran village. The photo you see here is the Lutheran church in Bertelsdorf, about 1930, early 1930s. The Lutheran church in Bertelsdorf had the sacraments of birth, baptism, and marriage for the Schwenkfelders. And they also performed funerals for Schwenkfelders, but the Schwenkfelders did not participate in any of the communion services. The church book in Bertelsdorf does have all the records for birth, baptism, and marriages and funerals in their books. In 1733, the King of Saxony was exiled because of harboring the Schwenkfelders and the Moravians. He was exiled from Saxony. And I'm sorry, the King of Saxony exiled the Schwenkfelders and had them leave by 1734. And soon thereafter, Zinzendorf also was exiled and went to England. Zinzendorf really wanted the Schwenkfelders to go to Georgia. He was sending Moravians there. But the Schwenkfelders really didn't want to do that. They wanted to be out from under Zinzendorf's thumb, and they made their way then to Pennsylvania. And along that way, Mennonites helped the Schwenkfelders on their journey. And Pennsylvania, you should know, had been heavily promoted in Germany. Was some of the earliest Germans to go to Pennsylvania were the Krefeld Mennonites in 1683.
Alan, this is David. Point of clarification: for this period in the 1720s and 1730s, when you're talking about this population of Schwenkfelders, how many people or families are we talking about? Are we talking about hundreds or dozens or thousands? Is it an extraordinarily tiny group of people, or is it relatively large? Is there documentation that tells us?
Yes, there is documentation. The number of Schwenkfelders who came to Pennsylvania was slightly over 200. The Schwenkfelders who went from Harpersdorf to Saxony first were around 225.
Okay.
Schwenkfelders in Silesia, I doubt that they numbered 1,000, but maybe 700, 800, somewhere in that figure. So most of them just simply became Lutherans for mainly economical reasons, social reasons, and stayed more or less there in Silesia.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
This map shows us the route of the Schwenkfelders from Silesia. This is the Silesian area. They went here into the Saxon area, took riverboats down the Elbe River to the North Sea, got a sea-worthy vessel and went around the coast down to the Netherlands. From there, they went on into Plymouth, and from there over to Pennsylvania. At that particular time, you had to go by a British ship in order to get into the British colonies. Altogether, they moved over a course of 8 years, beginning at the end of 1726 to September 22nd, 1734, when they landed in Pennsylvania. This building here, somewhat dilapidated, was photographed around 2006. It's known in Bertelsdorf as the Gemeindehaus. This was one of the houses that the Schwenkfelders had there. I'm sure it was not in that condition when the Schwenkfelders were there. But this was in East Germany during the Cold War. And so things were not always kept up as neatly as you would hope. What we see in this photograph right here is Zinzendorf's so-called palace or manor house. Again, this picture was taken in the late 1990s or very, very early 2000s. And you can see what terrible condition this house is in. Most of these houses had squatters in them during that particular time. They really didn't belong to anyone and nothing was kept up. Today, both of these buildings have been totally restored. Talk a little bit about some of the achievements of the Schwenkfelders in Pennsylvania. I think we're running out of time, aren't we? It's 7:30.
Oh, no, keep going. You're doing fine.
Okay. So they arrived on September 22nd, 1734. That's become known as their Thanksgiving Day or Day of Remembrance. As soon as they got off the dock in Pennsylvania, they gave thanks for the safe voyage. They settled between Macungie and Chestnut Hill. The Schwenkfelders themselves divided that up into upper, middle, and lower districts, as they called them. Like other German groups at that time who were radical, they were very insistent upon a separation of church and state, where Martin Luther did not go along with that premise. In 1758, they had cooperated with the Quakers with their attempt to settle the French and Indian War by a peaceful means rather than with military arms. The Schwenkfelders grew apart because they couldn't settle in one location as a group. So they gradually drifted apart from one another. And some clergymen, especially Christopher Schultz, made an attempt to bring the people back together as a community. And some of the things he did to do that was to publish a hymnal. They had never had their own hymnal before. He published a catechism. They organized their own school system that lasted about 30 years or a little more. They were in correspondence with fellow Schwenkfelders back in Silesia. And Melchior Dorn is the name of the last person considered to be a Schwenkfelder in practice, who died in 1826. Schultz published a book called The Vindication in German, Erläuterung, where he defended Caspar Schwenckfeld because rumors had come back to America that Schwenkfeld was being slandered terribly in the Silesian area. The Schwenkfelders took part in the Revolutionary War only under duress, mainly in a way of support like grain, housing for troops, and that type of military assistance. In 1782, they finally became an official organization called the Schwenkfelder Society. In 1783, a book was written called a compendium that is a summary of Schwenkfeld's theology and Schwenkfelder beliefs at that particular time. And they started to have a twice yearly conference on church matters, such as selecting of ministers, minister candidates, rules about marriage, especially outside the group, what's appropriate clothing, reprinting some of Schwenkfeld books here in Pennsylvania, and a new edition of the Vindication. This is often referred to as the Krause Palace. It gives us some idea of how Schwenkfelders lived in the 1730s, 40s. This was a very huge log house for the Schwenkfelders at that particular time. I don't know what the building was used for when this photo was taken at the end of the 1800s, but it has the first floor, a full second floor, and a third floor under the roof there. Here's a title page to the hymn book, part of the agreement for the school system. And around 1850, they wrote what they call the Constitution of the Schwenkfeld Society and actually printed it. It had been organized in 1782, but nothing about the rules had been printed until 1850. People were starting to forget, so they had to do that. There's many soldiers, Schwenkfelders, who participated in the Civil War. In 1877, the Lower District celebrates the Eucharist in church after rescinding the Stillstand we talked about in 1526 or so. The Constitution was translated into English and published in 1882. 1884 was a decision to create critical edition of the Schwenkfelders. And in 1894, 20 years or nearly 20 years later, the Upper District, the more conservative group of Schwenkfelders, celebrated the Eucharist for the first time. One of the ministers decided to keep a roll of members of the community, the Schwenkfelder Society, beginning in 1850. And so he filled out all the peoples. He made notes about when they died. And sometimes you find people who are crossed out. That is, they did not obey the rules of the community, and they would not repent their actions, and therefore they were scratched from the record. And so you can see this is just simply the Upper District in one area, and you get a feeling for the number of Schwenkfelders living there. A real short explanation about some matters of faith. Basically, there were two types of reformers, magisterial and radical. Luther is a perfect example of the magisterial reformers. They needed the support of the magistrates. That's why they're called the magisterial. The emperor, the kings, the princes, and so on, in order to launch and sustain a reform of the church. And so Luther had a very, very tight rope to walk. Schwenkfeld, on the other hand, is considered to be a member of the radical reformers. And as I pointed out previously, a major goal of this group was the complete separation of church and state. So what we see here is a etching, which is a frontispiece to a collection of Schwenkfeld's correspondence. And what Schwenkfeld did not really celebrate was the crucified Christ. In other words, the Christ on the cross. And he was not particularly interested in the risen Christ, that is to say, the crucifix, which is empty, where Christ has ascended. But what Schwenkfeld emphasized was the glorified Christ, the Christ at the right hand of God. And in this particular etching, we find here in the lower part on the left, Schwenkfeld kneeling there in worship of the glorified Christ, and on the right hand are the followers of Caspar Schwenckfeld. So the sacraments of the Catholic Church were 7, you see them there. But for Martin Luther, the sacraments were really just 2, those initiated by Jesus, namely the Eucharist and baptism. And he felt that there is no need for an intermediary between God and mankind. And so Schwenkfeld is much concerned about the Eucharist and people's understanding of what transpires during the Eucharist. And when he felt that people did not understand this, he suggested that we stop communing publicly in church until everyone believed the same or had the same interpretation of the Eucharist. As far as baptism is concerned, Schwenkfeld was not all that concerned about it. The Schwenkfelders believed in an adults or in a believer's baptism. They did not always baptize their infants. And the Schwenkfelders were usually attended by Lutheran ministers who were sympathetic toward Schwenkfelders when it came to marriage, baptism, and funerals. So the Eucharist was the hot button issue among the Protestant groups. And there are 4 basic different interpretations. There's the Roman Catholic, which is referred to as transubstantiation, where Jesus is present in the elements. Luther's consubstantiation, where there's a real presence of Christ in, among, under, between, and everywhere. Zwingli thought the elements were just symbols, empty symbols, that Christ was not present in the elements. And Schwenkfeld's interpretation was that the Holy Spirit worked in man to bring about a new life, a new man. And that was the essential part of the Eucharist. Say just a couple words here about baptism. That was never Schwenkfeld's focus. He was no doubt baptized when he was born, as that was the norm in the church. But he really only believed in adult baptism. In the 1600s and the 1700s, the church records show that Schwenkfelders brought newborn children to and witnesses to church for the ritual. But during the Jesuit mission, of course, they did not want their infants baptized by Catholic priests. In Saxony, the baptisms of newborns are recorded, as well as the funerals and the marriages of the Schwenkfelders in the Lutheran church there in Bertelsdorf. There are no records that we have found of infant baptism in Pennsylvania. And today there's really no set rule about when a child can be baptized or confirmed or some other type of celebration, but no one can become a member of the Schwenkfelder Church without baptism. So that is my presentation as far as Schwenkfeld and the Schwenkfelders are concerned. I would be happy to answer any questions at this time.
So, Alan, thank you. And I think with the last few slides, there's a question that was posed with their preference to adult baptism. Would the Schwenkfelders be considered Anabaptists, or because of their beliefs in Eucharist, do they kind of stand alone?
That certainly puts them alone. Whether they're Anabaptists, I think there are several reasons to feel that they were not leaning in that direction. For me, the major concern is the fact that Mennonites, as an example of Anabaptism, tended to be somewhat literal in their interpretation of the scriptures, where Schwenkfeld and the Schwenkfelders were definitely spiritualists and interpret the Bible in a spiritual way.
So these tenets that you describe for tenets of beliefs of Schwenkfelders with Eucharist, adult baptism, and others, those are core tenets of the religion that have carried through to the 21st century.
21st century pushes it a little bit. At the end
okay.
of the at the beginning of the at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 18th century, they started to reintroduce communion in a church. Prior to that, they did not commune in a church. They had no churches. They did not have meeting houses until, roughly 1790. They believed in communion. They could take communion privately or within the family group, but they did not do it publicly until the end of the 1800s.
With their links in to what we now know as Germany, with their linkage of the German language, when we think of the Anabaptist groups that settled in Lancaster County and southern Berks County, who developed and continued to speak the parlance of Pennsylvania Dutch, was that ever a Germanic language tradition that was associated with the Schwenkfelders, or again, because of their separation? If I think you said in the beginning of the program, the Schwenkfelders settled mostly in what's become Montgomery County.
Yes.
Did they ever develop that same, I guess, Pennsylvania dialect of German that you know of?
Yes. Let me explain just a little here. You're quite right that the Schwenkfelders came from the far eastern edge of German territory. And their dialect was not the same dialect as the people who came from the Alsace-Lorraine area.
Okay.
Those are two different dialects. But Pennsylvania Dutch doesn't start, I don't know when it really started, but people were probably not really speaking Pennsylvania Dutch much before 1800.
Okay.
So there's probably 50 to 60 years of Schwenkfelders being here in Pennsylvania before Pennsylvania Dutch became a means of communication throughout the different German-speaking groups. And the Schwenkfelders then definitely spoke Pennsylvania Dutch, but not because they came from Germany, but because that dialect was instituted here in America.
Gotcha. There is a question asked, the photograph you showed of the large log cabin that was associated as a meeting place for the Schwenkfelders, where was or is that located?
That was called the Kraus Palace, and that no longer stands. That photo was taken at the end of the 1800s.
But in what, in Montgomery County?
In Montgomery County, yes.
Okay, okay. With this, until they reintroduced a more public form of communion, if communion was private, a question is asked, who performed communion if it was done at home or in a private setting?
Well, we don't know exactly how that was done. In other words, I cannot tell you whether they used wine or what they used as the blood, the element, and what sort of bread they may have had. I cannot tell you. We have nothing in our records to give any details of that sort.
Other than it was a family-oriented, very private affair.
Yes, that's clear.
Okay. With their following adult baptism, how was it performed? In a creek, in a formal setting, informal setting? Do you have documentation that focuses on that?
No, I'm sorry to say we don't.
Wow. Okay. So when you refer to these actions as being private, they very much were.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
I mean, some of the infants were baptized. There are church records in Germany that show that infants were baptized in the Lutheran church. And so I'm assuming the priest performed the ceremony and holy water or appropriate water was used for that purpose. But we have no record of what actually was done here in Pennsylvania.
We do have another question, is that even with the concentration of the Schwenkfelders in our region of southeastern Pennsylvania, as you go through the 19th and 20th century, do you find the faith growing? Do you find families relocating to other parts of our greater northeastern region or the United States? Or is it really just in this corner of the mid-Atlantic?
Schwenkfelder descendants live all over the United States.
Okay.
There's probably not a single state that does not have a Schwenkfelder descendant. The Schwenkfelder Church exists only in southeast Pennsylvania. Always has, never expanded.
And is it you'll have to remind me, Alan, what township, what community is the Heritage Center located?
We're located in Pennsburg.
Pennsburg, okay.
Yes, I think that's Upper Hanover Township.
So when you look at although there are descendants that have dispersed around the country, when you look at those that not only identified as Schwenkfelders, but practice the faith, it's still concentrated in a relatively small area.
Yes. The main church is in Lansdale.
Oh, okay.
And that's called Central Schwenkfelder Church. And then Palm Schwenkfelder Church is in a small town called Palm, just a couple miles up the road from the Heritage Center.
Okay. Great. And for folks who'd like to visit the Heritage Center, as well as your library, your archives, are there standard operating hours?
Yes, there are. We have a website. You can find the hours there. We are open to the public every day except Monday.
And is it schwenkfelder.org?
Yes,
Okay.
www.schwenkfelder.org.
Okay. There is another question. Did the Schwenkfelders continue their association with the Moravians when they arrived in Pennsylvania?
Yes, very definitely. They were in close contact with the Moravians in the Bethlehem area. The Moravians went back and forth between Pennsylvania and Germany often. I can't tell you how frequently, but a couple times a year there would be different groups going back and forth. And this is one way that the Schwenkfelders kept in contact with their relatives left back in Germany. They would send packets of letters by the Moravians or through the Moravians back to Silesia, and the Schwenkfelders in Silesia would send their packets of letters with the Moravians coming back to Pennsylvania. And the Schwenkfelders had other contacts with Moravians in this area too. They had the contacts in Saxony because they were both on Zinzendorf territory at that particular time. So there was an organization, a fellowship that included Moravians along with Schwenkfelders and other sects as well in the early 1700s. So there were a lot of contacts with the Moravians.
One of our participants in the chat box has put in a link to the Schwenkfelder website, and she's also posted that she's taking your class at the Heritage Center to learn to better read both German type fonts and handwriting from 1600 to 1900.
Yes.
Another question: how large would you say is the overall Schwenkfelder congregation today? Still just in the realm of several hundred?
No, I would say it's around 2,000, maybe to 2,200, something like that.
Is there a reason why, as the Schwenkfelder faith grew, that they did not take the exact spelling of Caspar's last name?
I don't quite understand the question. Caspar's name is spelled with a CK, which would have been normal when he was alive.
Okay.
Today we spell Schwenkfelder with just a K, but that's what English influenced
Gotcha.
the Schwenkfelders to do.
Gotcha. Great. Well, it looks like those are the questions we have. For those of you, if you go into the chat box, not only do we have a link to the Schwenkfelder website, but for those of you who continue to be interested in the work that we do, this Thursday we'll be participating in another virtual lecture that focuses on the collections of our other state museums. It's called the Collection Showcase. It's featured on our website, and we'll be looking at objects that are considered the most rare, endangered, or unique of the collections throughout the Pennsylvania State Museums. If you would like to support us and support the Landis Valley Associates, and you're interested in ensuring that we can maintain our platform and other programming, we have a link to donate. And other than that, Alan, thank you so very much for joining us. I know that when we look, for me as an outsider coming to Pennsylvania 6 years ago, I've really learned of the richness and the diversity of the wide variety of Protestant faiths that settled here in the 18th and the 19th century, even the 17th century. So I'm coming away with a much richer appreciation of how the Schwenkfelders, who they are and how they stand apart from the other groups that settled in this corner of the world. So thank you again, Alan. Greatly appreciate your time and your talent. Thank you all for joining us. Hopefully we'll see you all on Thursday. Check our website. And the date hasn't been selected, but our next presentation towards the end of March, we'll be looking at the Demuth family and the Moravians, as well as the famous Demuth with the foundation and the work that's now displayed in the business district at the Demuth Foundation Museum. So thank you all for joining us. We will be posting this onto the Landis Valley YouTube channel within a week or so. So thanks for coming. Thanks again, Alan. And hopefully we'll see you back here on Zoom. Good night, everyone.
Good night.